She was 32 years old, a woman who had spent most of her adult life believing that love, real love, the kind that holds you steady through storms and silence, was something she deserved. Her name was Marlene Gideon. She had grown up in a small town in rural Georgia, the daughter of a school teacher and a mechanic, raised on Sunday dinners and the firm belief that a good man was worth waiting for. And she had waited. She had watched her friends marry in their 20s, watched their children grow, watched their social media pages fill with anniversary photos and family vacations. Marlene had smiled through all of it. She was not bitter. She was, as those who knew her would later describe, simply patient. Then, in the autumn of her 31st year, she met Douglas Crane. Douglas was 41 years old, broadly built, with a slow smile that took its time crossing his face, the kind of smile that made a person feel like they had earned something. He worked in agricultural equipment sales, traveling through 4 states, which explained, he said, why he had never quite settled down. He told Marlene on their second date that he had been engaged once, years ago, but that the relationship had ended before it became something permanent. He said it quietly, without drama, the way a person mentions a scar they have carried long enough to stop being ashamed of. Marlene believed him. She had no reason not to. Over the following 8 months, Douglas Crane presented himself as everything Marlene had been waiting for. He was attentive without being suffocating. He remembered the names of her coworkers, called her mother on her birthday, showed up to her niece's school play with flowers. He was, by every visible measure, a man who understood how love was supposed to behave. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in March, at the kitchen table, without a restaurant or a sunset or anything rehearsed. He slid a ring across the table and said simply, "I've been trying to figure out how to do this right, and I realized there's no right way, just this." Marlene said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding was planned for 6 months later, a Saturday in September, small, intimate, held at a converted barn outside of town that her cousin had rented for the occasion. 63 guests, white dahlias, a catered dinner of roasted chicken and sweet potato pie. Everything Marlene had quietly imagined for years. No one, not her mother, not her best friend, not the cousin who booked the barn, not a single person in that circle of 63 had any reason to believe that the day would not unfold exactly as planned. But 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Marlene Gideon received a phone call that would fracture everything she thought she knew.
It was 10:47 in the morning. Marlene was seated at a vanity table in the bridal suite of the barn, her hair already pinned, her veil draped across the back of the chair. Her maid of honor, a woman named Charisse, was in the adjoining room pressing the final wrinkles from the bridesmaid dresses. The room smelled of hairspray and gardenia candles. Marlene's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, an area code she did not recognize, 614, which she would later learn belonged to Columbus, Ohio. She almost let it go to voicemail. She almost did. She answered it. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, calm, controlled, with the particular stillness of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say many times before saying it. The woman identified herself as Sandra Ellison, and then she said something that Marlene would describe later to investigators as feeling like the floor opening beneath her feet. Sandra Ellison told Marlene that she was Douglas Crane's wife. Not his ex-wife, not a former girlfriend, his wife, current, legal, married in February of 2019 in a ceremony in Columbus, Ohio, in front of 42 guests in a church where Douglas had wept at the altar. Marlene said nothing. Sandra kept talking. She told Marlene that she had discovered Douglas's plans to marry again only 4 days earlier when she had found a wedding invitation addressed to a mutual acquaintance tucked inside a jacket pocket while doing laundry. She told Marlene that she had spent those 4 days trying to decide what to do. She told Marlene that she was sorry. She said that word twice. And then Sandra said something else, something that hit harder than anything before it. She told Marlene that she was not the first. There had been another woman before Sandra, a woman named Priya Menon, married to Douglas in 2015 in a civil ceremony in Tennessee. That marriage, Sandra believed, had never been legally dissolved either. Douglas Crane had not been engaged once years ago and walked away before things became permanent. Douglas Crane had been married 3 times. All 3 marriages were, to Sandra's knowledge, still legally intact. He had simply moved between lives the way other men change addresses, quietly, without announcement, leaving each version of himself behind, like a set of clothes he had grown tired of wearing. Marlene sat at that vanity table, in her wedding dress, with her hair pinned and her veil draped over the chair, and she listened to all of it. When Sandra finished, Marlene thanked her, politely, deliberately, the way a person thanks a doctor who has just delivered a devastating diagnosis. She ended the call. She sat for a long moment, looking at herself in the mirror. And then Marlene Gideon made a decision that would determine the rest of her life and end 2 others. She was going to go through with the wedding.
What happens inside a person in the moments after a revelation that changes everything? Investigators, psychologists, and journalists who would later examine this case spent considerable time trying to understand what Marlene Gideon was thinking as she sat in that bridal suite 2 hours before the ceremony and chose not to stop it. What the evidence would eventually suggest is this. Marlene did not continue with the wedding out of denial. She was not in shock. She did not disbelieve Sandra Ellison. By the time the ceremony began, Marlene Gideon had already formed a plan. The wedding was not a surrender to circumstances. It was, investigators would conclude, the first step in a calculated sequence. She stood up from the vanity. She smoothed the front of her dress. She walked into the adjoining room where Charisse was standing with a steamer, looked at her closest friend directly in the eyes, and said simply, "Let's get ready." Charisse would later tell investigators that Marlene seemed different in that moment. Quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Still in a way that felt deliberate rather than calm. But Charisse attributed it to nerves. She handed Marlene a glass of water and told her she looked beautiful. Marlene smiled. She drank the water. She said nothing about the phone call. Over the next 90 minutes, Marlene behaved with extraordinary composure. She greeted her mother, who had driven 3 hours for the wedding. She hugged her niece, who was serving as a junior bridesmaid. She signed the photographer's timeline sheet. She tipped the florist's assistant who had delivered the bouquets. She did everything a bride is supposed to do in the final hours before a wedding, and she did it without a single visible crack. Investigators would later pull the security footage from the barn's entrance camera. They watched Marlene walk through the lobby at 12:15, bouquet in hand, laughing at something her cousin said. There is no tremor in her walk. There is no hesitation. What the camera could not show, of course, was what was moving through her mind. Douglas Crane arrived at the venue at 12:30, an hour before the ceremony. He was driven by his best man, a colleague from work named Terry. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a white pocket square, and the slow, confident smile that had first made Marlene believe he was the man she had been waiting for. He did not know about the phone call. He had no idea what was coming.
At 12:50, 15 minutes before guests were to be seated, Marlene slipped away from the bridal suite alone. She told Charisse she needed 5 minutes by herself. Charisse assumed she meant fresh air, or a private moment of prayer, or simply the quiet that brides sometimes need before they walk into the largest moment of their lives. Marlene walked instead to the parking lot, to her own car, which she had driven to the venue the previous morning when dropping off decorations. She opened the trunk. She retrieved something from a bag that she had placed there the night before. The detail of that bag, its presence, its contents, the fact that it had been placed there the night before, hours before the phone call from Sandra Ellison, would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case, because it raised a question that prosecutors and defense attorneys would argue over for months. Was the phone call from Sandra the beginning of Marlene's plan, or had the plan already existed before Sandra ever called? If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight. The ceremony began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. 63 people were seated inside the barn, the afternoon light coming through the high windows in long golden columns. The officiant, a family friend named Reverend Charles Abbott, stood at the front. Douglas Crane stood beside him, hands clasped, watching the door. The music began. Marlene walked in on her father's arm. Every account from guests who were present that day describes the same image. Marlene was composed, almost unnervingly so. She walked without rushing. She looked directly at Douglas the entire time. Several guests would later describe it as the most focused expression they had ever seen on a bride, not emotional, not tearful, not glowing, focused. Douglas smiled when he saw her, that slow smile, the one she had once found disarming. The ceremony proceeded normally. Reverend Abbott delivered his opening remarks. 2 readings were performed by family members. When the vows were exchanged, both Marlene and Douglas spoke clearly, without stumbling. When the officiant pronounced them married, Douglas leaned in to kiss her. She let him. And then the reception began. What happened over the following 4 hours is documented through a combination of guest accounts, venue staff testimony, and security camera footage. Marlene was present at every expected moment. She sat beside Douglas at the head table. She ate. She raised her glass for the toasts. She danced one slow song with her father. She cut the cake. She thanked guests. She was, outwardly, a bride at her own wedding reception. Douglas was relaxed, jovial, moving easily between tables of guests. He had no reason to be anything else. At 5:47 in the evening, Douglas excused himself to use the restroom. The men's facilities at the barn were located at the far end of a hallway adjacent to the main reception hall. Security footage shows Douglas walking in that direction at 5:47 and 17 seconds. He did not return to the reception hall. At 6:02, a venue staff member discovered Douglas Crane on the floor of the hallway, approximately 12 feet from the restroom entrance. He was unresponsive. The staff member called for help. By the time other staff members arrived, it was clear that Douglas was in serious medical distress. Emergency services were contacted at 6:04. Douglas Crane was pronounced dead at 6:41 that evening at the Regional Medical Center. He was 41 years old. In the immediate aftermath, the cause was unknown. The circumstances were devastating, but at first glance appeared potentially natural. A man collapsing at a high-stress event, cardiac event, sudden illness. But the medical examiner would find no evidence of cardiac failure. What the toxicology screen would find 72 hours later was something no one at that wedding had been prepared to consider. The toxicology results confirmed that Douglas Crane had died as a result of acute poisoning. The specific compound identified was a substance that, while not a household name, is accessible to individuals who know where to look and is lethal in concentrated doses when administered without the knowledge of the recipient. The compound had been introduced into a drink, specifically a glass of whiskey that Douglas had consumed approximately 40 minutes before his collapse. The investigation, led by the County Sheriff's Department in conjunction with state criminal investigators, moved quickly once the toxicology results were confirmed. In cases like this, where the victim is surrounded at the time of death by a specific, identifiable group of people, investigators begin with proximity. Who had access to Douglas Crane's drink? Who had motive? Who had knowledge? The answers to all 3 questions led to the same person. Marlene Gideon. During initial interviews conducted on the evening of Douglas's death, while investigators were still treating the situation as a possible medical event, Marlene had been interviewed as the grieving widow. She had answered questions quietly, appropriately, with the stillness that those around her had been observing all day. She provided a timeline of the evening. She expressed shock. She was sent home. When the toxicology results came back, investigators returned to those early interviews with new eyes, and several things shifted in their significance. The first was the bag in the trunk of Marlene's car. Discovered during a consent search of her vehicle the day after Douglas's death, the bag contained, among other things, a pair of nitrile gloves. The bag had been placed in the trunk the night before the wedding. The second was a receipt. Found during the search of Marlene's home, the receipt was from an online supplier and was dated 3 weeks before the wedding. The item purchased corresponded to the compound identified in the toxicology report. The third was the phone call from Sandra Ellison, which investigators discovered when they obtained Marlene's phone records. Sandra, when contacted by investigators, confirmed the details of that conversation. She confirmed the time, 10:47 in the morning. She confirmed what she had told Marlene. And investigators were left with the same question that the bag in the trunk posed. The purchase had been made 3 weeks before the phone call. Marlene had bought the poison before she knew about the other wives. This detail reshaped everything. It suggested that Sandra Ellison's call, while undoubtedly significant, was not the origin of Marlene's plan. It suggested that something else had occurred, something Marlene had discovered or suspected before that Tuesday morning in the bridal suite. Investigators went back further. They pulled Douglas's financial records, his phone records, his travel history, and what they found painted a portrait of a man who had been living in extraordinary compartments, 3 separate lives maintained through constant management of information, geography, and deception. But it also raised the question of which detail Marlene had discovered first, and when. When investigators returned to arrest Marlene Gideon 11 days after the wedding, they came with a warrant and a full case file. She was charged with first-degree murder. During the search of her property conducted under that warrant, they made a second discovery. Sandra Ellison was dead. Sandra Ellison, the woman who had called Marlene 2 hours before the wedding to warn her about Douglas, had been found unresponsive in her Columbus, Ohio apartment 3 days after Douglas's death. Her cause of death had, at the time, been under investigation by Columbus police as a separate matter. It was only when the two investigations connected, through the shared name of Douglas Crane, through the phone records, through the timeline, that the full picture emerged. Sandra Ellison had also been poisoned. The compound was the same. Investigators now faced a case that extended across 2 states and involved 2 victims who were connected by a single man, Douglas Crane, and by a single woman, Marlene Gideon. The question of how Marlene had reached Sandra Ellison, or whether she had traveled to Ohio in the days immediately following the wedding, became the center of the multi-jurisdictional investigation that followed. Phone records showed a call placed from Marlene's phone to Sandra's number the evening after Douglas's death, a call that lasted 11 minutes. Location data from Marlene's phone placed her in the Columbus area 48 hours later. The prosecution's theory, presented when the case went to trial 14 months after the wedding, was this: Marlene Gideon had begun investigating Douglas Crane weeks before the wedding. She had discovered, through her own research, enough to suspect that he was not who he presented himself to be. She had purchased the poison. She had formed a plan. The phone call from Sandra on the morning of the wedding had not created her motivation. It had compounded it, and it had created a witness. Sandra Ellison had known that Marlene received the information about Douglas's other wives. Sandra could have testified about that phone call. Sandra could have raised in court the question of what Marlene knew and when. Sandra Ellison, by making that call, had made herself a liability. And Marlene, according to prosecutors, had treated her as one. The defense presented a different theory. They argued that the purchase history was circumstantial, that the location data was explainable, that Marlene had acted in a state of profound psychological distress following a catastrophic betrayal. They invoked the concept of a woman who had been systematically deceived by a man who had made deception his way of life, and who had collapsed under the weight of that betrayal in ways that distorted her judgment irreparably. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Marlene Gideon was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. She was 33 years old at the time of sentencing. She showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. She looked, those in the courtroom would later say, the same way she had looked all day on her wedding day. Composed, still, somewhere behind her eyes, unreachable. The investigators who had worked the case, the county sheriff's detectives, the state criminal analysts, the Columbus officers who had first responded to Sandra Ellison's apartment, would later describe this as one of the most methodically constructed crimes they had encountered in their careers, not because of its violence, which was quiet and chemical and designed to look like something else, but because of its patience, because of the distance between the purchase of the poison and the act itself, because of the gap between what Marlene Gideon appeared to feel and what she had apparently already decided. A man who had spent years building false lives had walked into a wedding that was itself false in ways neither he nor his guests understood. And a woman who had spent years waiting for the right person had, in the end, chosen not to wait at all. 3 people entered that September Saturday with futures they believed were intact. None of them left it the same way.
Douglas Crane died in a hallway 12 feet from a restroom, in a charcoal suit with a white pocket square, still wearing his wedding ring. Sandra Ellison died in her apartment in Columbus 3 days after making a phone call she believed was the right thing to do. Marlene Gideon is alive. She will remain incarcerated by the court's order for the rest of her natural life. The barn where the wedding was held has since been repurposed. It serves now as an event space for corporate gatherings and occasionally other weddings. The owners repainted it the spring following the trial. They chose a color called quiet white. The 63 guests who attended that September ceremony have, in the years since, largely stopped talking publicly about what they witnessed. Several have given accounts to journalists. A few have spoken to true crime researchers. Most have simply tried to file it away in the part of the mind reserved for things that defy ordinary explanation. What all of them remember, when pressed, is the same moment. The moment Marlene walked in on her father's arm. The way she looked at Douglas Crane without blinking. The expression on her face that no one could quite name at the time because it did not match the occasion. They know now what it was. It was not nerves. It was not joy. It was not even grief. It was certainty. She had already decided. She had already set the thing in motion. She walked down that aisle not toward a future, but through the final hours of a plan that had been weeks in the making.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.